Roundtable for the Barber of Seville. I want to start by actually saying a special thank you. We have Scott Howard here, and this event is actually being sponsored by Regis Bank. Thank you very much, Scott. To start with, I'd like for each of the artists up here to introduce themselves and tell you what they're doing in this production, starting with the conductor.
I'm Robert Lyall, the conductor. I'm Matthew Lata, stage director.
I'm Michele Angelini, singing the Count Almaviva.
Deborah Domanski, singing Rosina.
Lenora, singing Berta.
I think everybody probably knows the story of Barber of Seville. But to kick us off, why don't we just, as a group, kind of tell us a story of what happens in the Barber of Seville.
Well, someone gets shaved. And it's funny. I'll let Almaviva tell it. It's his,
I don't know.
I'll let you tell it from your point of view.
Well, I guess, yeah, the story exists because of what my character initiates. And he has seen a lovely girl from afar, and he's fallen in love with her, so he has...
We have props for this explanation.
He's made many efforts to find out who she is, what her story is, and all he knows is that there is a doctor that he presumes to be her father. And he's been singing outside her balcony for several weeks, and, you know, typical Cyrano de Bergerac type stuff, and he is not getting a response that he's looking for, and he's just about to give up hope when all of a sudden this brash vagabond on the street comes along who was formerly in his employ. And so the Count and Figaro reconnect, and the Count enlists Figaro as his helper, and basically says, you know, I need your help, I don't know what to do. And the good fortune is that Figaro has been now working in this household, and tells him, no, it's not the daughter of this doctor, but his student. And so this gives the Count lots of hope, and the two of them get into all sorts of mayhem and disguises and ruses to try and not only win over her heart, but to pull a fast one on the bad guys.
Now, if I'm Figaro, telling the story from my point of view, I'm down on my luck. I haven't made a sale. I need a patient. I'm about ready to give up because I can't even afford to pay the rent on my shop. Who should come along but this wealthy Count who I used to work for? Didn't end well. I got fired. Fired me, or I fired him. But you know what? He really means something. And he's richer than ever. So I'm prepared to, it so happens that I am in a position to help him. And although we stumbled a few times, he finally gets what he wants, and that's the girl, and I finally get what I want, and that's the story of the Barber of Seville.
Well, continue with that thought. Now, what is it in the mind of Rosina? Where is she coming from?
Well, she's been shut up in this house of Dr. Bartolo, being taught music and etiquette, and basically he's waiting for her to come of age so he can marry her. So she's very young, probably around, I don't know, 13, right? 14, 15, 16?
Okay.
But they got married early back then.
You just listen to the coloratura.
We'll say 16. They got married young back then. So she is locked up in this house with this guy waiting to marry her, and all she knows is literally what's out the balcony. She doesn't get to go out. She is so curious about everything. Any person that comes into her contact, like when Figaro comes in the house, she's like, oh my God, tell me everything. I want to know everything that's happening. And he's really her only outlet to the regular world. My relationship relationship with Berta, who is the lady of the house, is not good because she works for Bartolo. She's his eyes and keeps a watch out after me. So I have no comments on her. And I've been very, very good up until this point. But now there's this amazing guy outside my window, and he happens to be really amazing, and I'm excited, and I can't wait to meet him. So there's, as we say, there's lots of foibles in the house to try to get me out of the house and into the Count's arms. But, and as we know, it's a happy ending. So it's sort of interesting how the Dr. Bartolo, who's not here to tell us his point of view, but it's interesting how he comes around at the end of the opera and bows to the Count and says, okay, you can have her. He comes to terms with it, which is an interesting theme through a lot of operas. There's this reconciliation at the end of many operas, a lot of Handel operas as well. And it's sort of my favorite part of opera. It's like there's all this craziness that happens throughout the entire opera, and in the last 2 minutes, as in the Nozze di Figaro, when the Count says to Rosina, my character, Countess Almaviva, in the end, you know, forgive me, and she forgives him. And it's sort of an interesting theme throughout opera, and this has it too.
Well, Matthew, why don't you, speaking of Bartolo, give us Bartolo's position?
Well, as Bartolo, first of all, I assume that I have a right to anything that's in my house, and that includes Rosina. There's no backstory about how she got there. She's probably my ward, you know, and I firmly believe that a young lady should be brought up that way, and it's certainly not impossible that a man of my age should take her as wife, and that's what I'm planning to do. I'm a little bit paranoid. I'm fairly well off. I'm a doctor, which means I'm a learned man, but there's very little in the piece that shows that I'm doctoring. I'm mostly paranoid. I keep my house locked. I pay my servants to watch her and tell me everything that's going on. Yet I have a little bit of a weakness. I can't do everything for myself, so I make the mistake of hiring Figaro, who then hires himself to the next highest bidder, the Count, and betrays me. Also in my employ is Don Basilio, who is Rosina's music master, and is actually Michele, the playwright who wrote this play, Slap Against the Clergy and some other things. There's a lot of politics in these plays. In the end, I'm forced to acknowledge that maybe this wasn't meant to be, and that the Count has more right to her than I do, and maybe there's another prospect.
Of course, the star of the opera is Berta, right? Yes.
Well, this is my house, basically, although it bears the name of, Bertolo is my name and everything, but I take care of the house. And I pretty much know everything that's going on in the house. I know that Rosina is having her little fling, but it's my job to make Bartolo happy. And, you know, I may have a little crush on Bartolo, which is why I'm staying there. She has her own little secrets, but basically just keeping everything together. I'm the glue.
So you're also a collaborator in a way.
Collaborator?
Because you had your own interests.
I do have my own interests. And let's just say they all come together in the end. And you know my interests in other stories, like Figaro, as I'm not sure why the names get mixed up, but as Angelini, Figaro is actually her son. So, Berta is played very well.
I'd like to ask Robert, this really is a great cast. This is a great cast where you have up-and-coming stars in the repertoire. You have established, Ramey is a long-time international star. Tell everybody what it's like putting together a cast like that.
Well, it's fun. I think an important part of my job as the artistic side of my job is to have appropriate audition processes. And for 31 years, I have held New York auditions where I go for a week, often a day or two more, and I hear singers from 10 in the morning until 6 in the evening, non-stop. Oh, I tell you, people say, oh, how can you do that day after day? It's the best education you can get. And levels are set after let's say the first day, the second day as to what you're dealing with. I listen only to managed singers, that is, people that have achieved a representation that makes them more competitive in the professional world, because there are so many singers that have as yet arrived at that level, and that would be overwhelming. First year or two that I did it, I made very open auditions, and what I found is that I didn't get to hear many managed singers because there were so many other people. So you look at the rosters and you invite the rosters to submit their artists. Sometimes the manager comes with them, sometimes they just have the singers. We're all adults, so it's really very easy. They come through the door and they sing for me, and I generally ask them to sing their first choice. They are generally aware of the repertory that the New Orleans Opera is casting on Grand Rapids, where I'm also the director, and will have prepared a specific body of repertory to compete for these positions. I make my notes, and then after a week of listening, then I sit down and I digest what I've heard, and then I start inviting people to join us as our cast for the coming season. Sometimes people are not available, people that I'm particularly interested in, but I keep files over all of these years. And I also do a lot of general casting. The symphony will call me and ask me if I would recommend a tenor for a program, or another company might call me desperately in need of a Gioachino, and to make a suggestion and so forth. So it's a pretty comprehensive process that I feel has kept me in touch with. So I listen all day, and then in the evenings I go to the Met or Carnegie Hall virtually every evening. And I love the art form, so I'll go to the Monday night performance at the Met, and then I'll also go back on Thursday night for the repeat performance. No two performances are the same. Identical cast, identical conductor, and the dynamic of a performance can be very, very different. But, so I get to see a lot of the people that audition for me working on stage, and that's also very helpful. So then I go through and I say, okay, to me, I think there's a new sensibility in the world of opera, and that is, we used to joke and say it is, there's really no such term as operatic acting. That opera singers could not act, that they just, as we derisively say, park and bark. That they find a place on the stage where there's good lighting, and they deliver their part in a more declamatory style. That's not at all true today. Nor is the line, for all of the fun in it, that it ain't over the fat lady sings, applicable to a lot of opera singers today. Look at Miss Domanski, if you'd like an example. But the truth is that each fach, as we call it, a fach is a body of repertory that singers present as the best materials that they sing. It represents their instrument and perhaps their physiognomy, things of that sort. So Wagnerian singers, not surprisingly, might be heavier than lyric singers. So it kind of comes with the territory. But generally there is a great awareness on the part of performers that they need to be capable of completely delivering the role, and that might require a lot of agility physically. And comedy is obviously can be more physically demanding than drama, and then again, if you have to jump off of a building, as Tosca does, that can be physically demanding too. So people will move toward the repertoire that best fits their voice, their temperament, their personality, and their physical requirements. And so when you weigh all of these things, and it starts, the very famous line that is attributed to Verdi. What are the three things it takes to have an opera career? And he said, voce, voce, e voce. The voice, 3 times. You have to start with the voice. Now we look for the package. We look for somebody that has wonderful theatrical sensibilities, that looks appropriate for the role, and actually has the vocal equipment to deliver to the role. And at that point, then it becomes a matter of taste as to whether that is, you think, better suited this way. So
as both, I would say, artistic director and conductor, maybe one of the most important people to choose would be the director for the production.
well, I won't speak for Matthew Lata, with whom I have worked for many years, but many different kinds of productions. It's a quantum leap from, let's say, Malo and Mascara to the Barber of Seville. Matthew did our New Orleans-based Malo and Mascara last season. But I would toss out this thought for you, and I don't want to lecture because I want you to hear my colleagues speak about this opera. There are 2 reference points that I think can enrich your understanding of this particular opera. One is the 3 Beaumarchais plays that were so important in Europe. The most frequently cited anecdote about that is these plays launched the French Revolution. And we look, because they were about class warfare. This is based on the first of the plays, and then the Marriage of Figaro is based on the second. And the Guilty Mother, Mère Coupable, has been set as an opera form, but it's never been defined. But if you understand that there is great joy and fun and slapstick and in this style, which is very different from the dark undercurrents of the Marriage of Figaro, which is about the droit de seigneur and the servants constantly one-upping, but for very serious stakes, the nobility. In this case, of the many disguises which Almaviva wears as a noble, not as the servant, but as a noble, and therein lies an important distinction, is critical to your understanding. Plot. The other reference point is Commedia dell'arte. This is truly an opera buffa. And that is a genre in and of itself that, yes, it's comic opera, but it also has origins in a very specific Italian acting style with very specific stereotypical characters, of which Rosina is one, though usually in earlier iterations was a high soprano, and the Almaviva is one, and the character of Bartolo, either a doctor or a lawyer. All of these characters are very richly developed in the history of Commedia dell'arte. And so you find then where the balance is for that. And at that point, I'll turn those observations over to the stage director, because I think this is the individual that in the process makes the choice about which of those 2 rich repositories he draws from to enhance the character, to be consistent with the period of the piece, with the style of the piece, whether slapstick solves the problem or creates the problem, or just is simply there for the sheer enjoyment of yet another pie in the face, and so forth. And that, to me, is the director's dilemma in dealing with pieces like this, is how do you balance these very important historical and stylistic considerations?
Well, I think the first thing is what intrigues, what always stays with an audience is to find some humanity in a piece, no matter how slapstick it is, and some vulnerability in each character, so that you stick with them through the evening. Sometimes a character like Rosina, whose first aria is all about, I can do anything I want and I'm in charge, and I'll set traps for Bartolo and I'm going to get what I want. Well, if she does, and she's totally sure of herself, then why do we want to spend the evening with her, because she's already won? So it may be that she's stating her goal, but she isn't sure how she's going to get there. So that's, for me, is number 1, is to find that in each character. Yes, there's some slapstick in Barber of Seville. We don't indulge in a whole lot of it compared to some productions that I've seen, because I find if you and again, this is purely an opinion, everybody has one, but if you indulge in too much of that, then the audience starts to wait for the next bit and starts to lose the sense of the entire piece. Just as if a singer may have terrific high notes, but they're not really playing the through line of the character, you stop really paying attention to what they're doing, you just wait for the next high note or the next run. And years ago, in the days before surtitle, sometimes when the audience was really not able to follow that easily what was going on, I know as an audience member in those days, I found myself, I got tired of working by the end of the evening, and I was just waiting for the next runs and the next high notes because I couldn't follow what was going on. So that's, yes, there is fun in the piece. There's also an inherent absurdity in it. And what I like to do is present these real characters, real people, confronting situations which aren't necessarily real. For example, you know, when your harpsichord comes to life and starts moving around the stage, how do you deal with that? And if you're hearing music and it's coming from somewhere, well, I think I'm supposed to sing an aria here, so I guess I'd better grab an instrument and do it. So, but we want to see real people having to make these choices. Barber of Seville is not, the libretto could be considered, again, political, but that, as Robert said, that really didn't come to the fore until the marriage of Figaro. We're just trying to find balance here. You'll look, you'll see the physical style of a lot of these actors, and they all, I don't say actors, not singers, because that's from my point of view. But they all brought a lot of that with them. It's clear just from the way Michele stands that we know what character he is. From the way she stands, that we know what character he is. From the way that she walks, that we know what character she is. And that helps an audience.
We were talking about the runs and the coloratura. These roles are not easy to sing. This music is not easy. How, and this is for the singers, but also for all of you, how do you balance putting yourself physically in the best position to be able to sing great high notes, great runs, great coloratura, to be able to sing very fast and stay with the conductor at the same time? That has to happen. And not just stand there. How do you find the path to that?
Well, as Berta, the first thing you don't hear singing, you hear sneezing. And I had a little time trying to figure out how to sneeze without hurting my voice. If I was going to actually scream, how to actually make it funny for you and and for you to actually get it. So, and there are times where I'm way in the back where you can't see me and I'm sneezing and you have to hear me. So how in the world do I do that? It's more like an achoo rather than a achoo, So you have to put a lot of thought into it, and it's fun while you do it.
Well, I would say, like with anything, there's a certain level of training and determination and dedication that needs to be upheld with any art form, with any science, anything, any sort of field of study. With singing, there is a certain level of natural ability that comes along with things, and so some voices are more adept at being able to move their voice in a fast manner, or the range is a natural thing. You can stretch a range of a voice, but within certain limitations. I've done this opera with a woman. I won't even say soprano or mezzo because she's got everything from low F to high F. So she can sing Queen of the Night and she can sing contralto parts. And that's just her voice. That's not really something that can't make the voice be something other than what it is. But I would have to say that, at least historically speaking, Maestro Lyall mentioned Fox, and these are categories of voices and the kind of repertoire that falls within that particular category pertaining to certain voice types. And that's a relatively recent system employed, I guess from the late 1800s was when that first kind of came about.
Maybe later, even
later than that.
Mid-19th century.
Yeah, and so back in the day when these all of this music was being written, I mean, voices were still as different as they are today, but there was training that was involved that allowed and enabled voices to be able to sort of do everything. And today, in our modern sensibilities and modern vocal pedagogy, there seems to be a bit more of a disparate way of teaching voices and trying to hone in on what is naturally sort of present in a given voice. Because one voice, like I said, is going to be able to move better than another voice, and there's different vocal sizes, and composers later on started to write music that didn't apply to these sort of virtuosic passage work. So there's a lot of that sort of comes into play as well, and but it all just comes down to what your voice is capable of doing and how much you have studied, I guess.
For me, negotiating voice and acting, most of the time they go together very well, I find, just because the voice is an expressive instrument, that we've been blessed with so many different timbres that we can access, and not by manipulating the voice, but by moving the emotion through the voice. So in that sense, it's so much fun to just go through all the various emotions and acting and singing an aria with different intentions, you know, sing the same aria sad, sing it happy, sing one phrase happy, sing one phrase sad, sing it mad, sing it excited, and just play with all those different feelings. And I just came from a production of Barber of Seville set in the 1920s, and Rosina starts her aria in her underwear, putting on thigh-high stockings. So I'm doubled over trying to sing Una voce. And I look to the director and I say, okay, I'm going to change this a little bit. I'm going to put the nylons before I start singing. And that worked fine. And by the time I got here, I could sing, you know, all the high notes I wanted to. So there's a little bit of compromise with the physicality and the vocal lines, of course. And a good director will appreciate and understand that, which Matthew is. And what I love about this production is that we have opportunities for both a lot of action while we're singing, and when the going gets tough, the tough can just stand and sing. You know, that's what I love about some directors try to over-direct, but Matthew just sort of lets you be the character in that moment.
Also, movement is not acting. You know, if you listen to an old singer, say like Carlo Bellronzi or one of these guys, they didn't move at all. But did they act? You bet they did, because they couldn't make the audience feel something. As Deborah was saying, transport emotion through their voices, and that's ultimately what it's about. Also, I don't mean to take the floor.
No, please.
In a traditional production like this, this is the set that's been used in New Orleans before, dictates, in effect, a certain style. If we're starting from scratch, the way we essentially did with Ballo last year, there are more options. In this case, it's a traditional set. Either Rosina sings on a balcony or she sings in the room. There are no other choices. The costumes also exist. So this implies a fairly traditional approach, which includes, you know what, it's all right to come just down left and sing out your aria if you set it up correctly. And it's the director's job to provide an environment in which that then becomes not park and bark, but simply a natural and logical finish to something that's been set up in the beginning of the art. I'm kind of conservative too, in a way. I really like to hear singers. You can't hear them. You know, it's like you can be a brilliant conductor, but if you can't communicate that to the orchestra, then it doesn't matter.
Right. Absolutely.
I've sung in shows where the director had us, each character writhing on the floor during our arias at some point. And I was just like, okay, enough writhing already. Can we just, and you're right, it's not about movement, but it is about being in a place that lets the voice come through in its best way. And
Yeah, I'll agree with Deborah. We you can't divorce acting from singing, you just can't. And if your acting technique interferes with your singing or vice versa, then one or the other technique is simply flawed.
Well,
And I'm sorry.
No, please, please.
And how we hold ourselves on stage, is exactly just to expound a little bit more on what Matthew had said. Because it is being set in a certain period, it is part of our responsibility as the performers to know how people moved and certain social graces and social mores that would have been appropriate to that time period, that location, that style. And director is also there to help bring that kind of knowledge to us. And if we were doing this in 1920 or 1950, then we'd have a completely different physicality to how the show works. And that does have it has a certain role in terms of how the singing mechanism then is utilized, because there are some directors that have very, very, very physical productions, and there is a lot of movement, and so you have to find a way to adapt internally to still be able to execute as you would if you were just standing there singing, but still be able to do what you're being asked to do. That's part of the stage and it's part of the production. And some people go a little overboard with it, but more or less it's a nice collaborative effort, and every singer is different, so everyone's going to have something different to bring to that table.
And I think that difference is also right at the heart of this style. This is bel canto. Bel canto is a style that we recognize as specific, not totally discrete, because after all, we have Donizetti and Bellini also that are so strongly associated with this style, but also early Verdi. And yet, if I had to describe it in a simple statement, I would say that it is the singer's opera.
Okay.
So wherein lies the difference between what is a conductor's opera and a singer's opera? Well, what we just performed, Zalman, is really music drama. It is a conductor's opera. The orchestra is just as important a character as anyone on that stage, and comments constantly and pervasively on the drama and on the moments of characterization. In this instance, vocally, you're dealing with choices because you're given what is a framework. It's more than a skeleton, of course, but it is a framework. And then, as Michele just mentioned, the individual personalities and techniques of the singers are a huge factor in the approach to the performance. Now, it's a blessing in many respects because, as I mentioned the other night in the conversation, Rossini made a famous comment that the mezzo voice was the voice of the Italian woman. He loved the hue of it. He loved the richer, darker, weightier, whatever, of that voice compared to the tradition of commedia dell'arte soubrette. And so the question is there really such a creature in Abbas Ferreira that is a soubrette contralto? It's like saying, is there a white boulder? I mean, when we associate the weight of the chest voice and that color with the tessitura of this robe. Now, let's add to that the fact that for a generation or two, it was actually more popular to cast sopranos. And so these arias are available in higher keys, and it gives you a different texture on the stage. It gives you a different kind of brilliance that is just, stratospheric high notes as an option. And we had Roberta Peters and people like that essayed these roles for a complete generation, and everyone thought that was maybe more exciting than hearing lower voices. But actually the excitement is built into, I think, the total package, and that is the delivery of the role appropriately. And the choices that the singer can make is this, using this framework or the skeleton that I mentioned. By the time we get to Verdi, he has said, sing the piece the way I wrote it. I've written the melody, I don't want you changing it. Of course, you could put a trill in, you could do something like that, but nothing like the degree of filigree we associate with this style. And so where does that filigree come from? Well, ideally, it comes from the singer's imagination. Ideally, it is in fact a logical extension of the melodic figurations that are built into the melodies. And they're not just random high notes, and they're not random trills or turns. They actually enhance a superstructure that is there. But it also offers a singer a chance to play to their strengths. You know, if you have an especially brilliant upper register or especially great facility with fioritura or coloratura, however so called, then here is a chance to show this off. Or you can use it more selectively if that is not your register, so that you can, in some respects, tailor-make this vocal part to your own liking, as long as it makes any real logical sense. And sometimes you hear things that are not real logical sense. But you have a chance to have this suit made specifically for your voice through a series of choices. A lot of this material is available years and years, 2 centuries now, premiered in 1860. So, of traditions of how arias are sung. But, as I said to our Rosina, there are as many versions of this as there are Rosinas out there. You have the chance to do your thing the way you want to do it, and for me to accompany it in that fashion. So when I talk about it as singer's opera, I'm talking very specifically about their right in this style to do the embellishments that work for them. And people bring different degrees of either excitement to that, or understanding, or appreciation, or perhaps a choice for something that is very different. And it can be equally effective, but it is a choice that the singer makes.
Do you feel, this is a question for both of you,
Charles was asking a question.
You would say that Rossini liked Mezzo timbre better than he liked soprano.
There are virtually no leading female roles in the original scores that are soprano roles.
Now, when the vocal line in the score, is it written differently for soprano and mezzo?
Not at all.
Just the quality of the voice and the placement of the voice that makes it's the same note, essentially.
Maybe not. It actually might exist, Charles, in a transposition. We can do these arias in different keys for higher or lower voices. So, and that can affect the color of the piece. You transpose something up a step or a step and a half, that has a much more penetrating kind of brilliance than not.
I was wondering if the singers might comment on this opportunity to embellish.
Absolutely.
Some of us love it more than others, that's for sure. I've spent a great portion of my studies and my career learning about and working on this kind of embellishment, finding about the origins of it and traditions that have ensued. And initially, these things were all improvisatory. They really weren't written out. They weren't even probably decided upon, except in the moment. And centuries ago, singers were taught to do that, just the way a jazz musician today is taught to improvise. And in a sense, it has those elements of jazz in them, not rhythmically, not harmonically, but in the sense of something that happens in the moment. Today, however, since we do have larger orchestras, it's less of a chamber music type setting. We have larger theaters, we have more elaborate stage work, we have conductors, we have other elements that were not necessarily employed back then, so we do have a tendency to then be a bit more prepared in terms of knowing what we're going to do and really building it into our techniques and into our bodies and into our voices. And I've done this role with conductors who didn't really want anything, who really want it to be sort of as written, come scritto. It's a choice. It's not really correct. Historically, performance practice But it is a choice, and I've often theorized that one of the reasons why this opera in particular, compared to a lot of other operas that do involve a lot of virtuosic vocalism, one of the reasons why this particular one has managed to sort of stay in the repertoire constantly, and it's never left the repertoire anywhere, is because, well, a lot of cuts were being taken in it that sort of shortened the roles down. And usually the things that were cut were the things, except in the case of the female part, because women always remain sort of diva. They continue to bring that sort of vocalism through the years. But male voices tended to reduce as the Verismo school came about, and composers like Puccini and Mascagni and late Verdi, Wagner, Strauss, and as styles moved, male voices were not really taught to do these kinds of things so much any longer. Very few really continued to study and to work on these sorts of things. So in a sense, the cuts were employed not to make the opera shorter, although there are quite a few superfluous moments that we're not even going to expose you to. But it had to do with the difficulty of the vocalism, and in a sense, if I can be so crass about it, it was to dumb down some of the roles, to make it easier for the singers to sing. And so then an opera like this was able to be cast with a variety of different types of voices that were still able to get the basic fact and the basic melodies across, but they didn't have to worry about all of the embellishments and things. So we do have this sort of 20th century tradition that exists that does not employ a lot of embellishments and ornaments. But speaking for myself personally, the role of the Count is actually a rather low tenor part. It's not quite as high and as intrinsically virtuosic as a lot of the other Rossini tenor roles are. Again, one of the reasons why it has remained such a cornerstone for all different types of tenor voices is because it doesn't require so many extremities in the voice. But for a voice like mine, which tends to sit a bit higher, this role is really kind of low for me. So I've had to take the opportunities to decorate the vocal lines to make me happy. And hopefully you happy.
It makes us happy.
I want to ask a question of Matthew, and you said this earlier about finding the humanity in the characters. How, and with the singers as well, is how do you find humanity in comic characters that are based on commedia dell'arte?
Every character has something they want, and because they don't have it, they're vulnerable. And I think if you can bring that out, then it works. Commedia dell'arte characters, good commedia dell'arte, are very human, even though it's very codified. They're not two-dimensional at all. You're really drawn into the wants and the pain of these characters, even though it is a very broad physical style. The difference between, well, a show like I Love Lucy, yes, it's very funny, but the reason that show works is because the two protagonists are very human as well, and we get that. When I'm looking at a bit, and a lot of this cast has bits they've done before and things they like to do, I look at a bit and say, well, is it just for a laugh, or is it revelatory of character and we'll get a laugh? And if it's just for a laugh, maybe we want to look at it twice in this style. Again, that's my opinion. But if you're doing an opera, say, like L'Italiano in Algeri, maybe lends itself a little bit more to that kind of treatment. Barber has a little bit more in the libretto, and you can lose the characters in the bits.
Let me make a reference. I'm sure, looking at the age of the people in the room, everyone here is probably familiar with Red Skelton. Because this was modern commedia dell'arte, improvisatory theater. You give the man a prop, you give the man a suggestion, and he can improvise. Robin Williams in the modern era can improvise for half an hour and create an entire engaging narrative and be multiple characters. But that is the talent that Matthew was referencing about commedia dell'arte, characterization, that ability to just take the slenderest idea and improvise a just the simplest facial expressions, simple things like that. So the art form is not completely dead, although it does tend to think of it as a historical style. The best representation for us might be Pagliacci and perhaps Ariadne of Naxos. But so it's present in core operas, but the style was a part of early television. What was the second part of that question?
It was just about finding the humanity of the characters. And for the singers, I mean, do you ever find yourself stuck between going for the laugh or going for the humanity?
No, because life is fun. I mean, there are so many funny moments that that are real, and yeah, that's an interesting question. I've never thought of it one way or the other. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. They're funny, the bits, and sometimes it's timing, and sometimes it's playing off other people and playing off their bits. So it's sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. And one set of cast members may work well together, and another set may bring out more emotion. And it does depend a lot on your colleagues and what they bring to their role, and what works in their own body and what works in my body. So it's sort of interesting to take a role from place to place and play it with different cast members. So yeah, that's.
Well, I want to put the questions out to the floor, and does anybody have questions I could ask?
Have you sung before together, or were you all strangers?
I have not sung previously with anyone who's involved in the cast or in this production, so I'm a stranger.
Deborah and I actually did the same 1920s production of Barber together, just about a month ago.
Wherever you are in opera, there are never any more than 1 degree, maybe 2 degrees max of separation. There's always somebody in the cast you worked with before, somebody. I worked with Ramey, first of all, in 1988. Done 2 shows maybe, but it's just kind of old moment when you get back together.
I'd be curious to know, Robert, you do those auditions every December for a week, which just astounds me that you can do that. But I'm curious to know if the singers here auditioned with you at any time.
Everyone up.
Everyone?
Every person in this cast auditioned for me.
And you got to know them and you remember them, and
Well, I keep copious notes. It's a process that I go back and look at these things and say, well, this looks like the right person for this. As I say, sometimes you ask and they're not available, which is a good thing for them. I mean, we want everyone to succeed in this business, and the more work, the merrier. But if I have that degree of interest in them, then I will come back to that, and I'm looking at other casting opportunities and things like that. So, but as I say, it's certainly been a great learning experience for me over that many years to hear that many singers doing the repertoire that ostensibly fits their voice. Sometimes people make poor choices and sing roles that are too heavy for them, or that's probably the most common issue. Barber of Seville had a colorful history, and there are interesting things about it. For example, the overture wasn't written to be the Barber of Seville. It was actually spliced together from Elizabeth, the Queen of England was the title. Elizabeth Reign Inghilterra, and also Aureliana in Parmiera. So he just took two existing overtures that he had written and put them together. And so when I joke and say, well, now my charge is to make it sound like it's the overture to a comic opera, because in neither case was the music of that. And yet, if you listen to it, it has a vivaciousness about it that seems so perfectly appropriate, and they're written for completely different occasions. There was a very, very famous, by Giovanni Paisiello, setting of the Barber of Seville, and it was at the top of the charts in its day. So much so that when Rossini himself decided to set this famous play, he went to Paisiello and said, "Maestro, would you be offended if I tried my feeble hand at setting this? Nothing could ever displace your masterpiece." And of course, the second that this caught fire, no one's done Paisiello or Barber of Seville since then. But in fact, the opening of this piece was not a success. The first couple of performances were booed off the stage. People protested elements of the style. They felt that the buffa basso parts with all the pattern and all that was very old-fashioned and so forth. And so, and the style was waning at that point. I think the last number of buffa was written about 1850. But it has survived, as Michele says. It's never really been out of an important and visible place, and its American premiere was given right here in New Orleans. So, yes.
Here, here.
Yes, sir.
I'm going to imagine that out of every 100 operas that you all sing, no more than 10 of them, and maybe many fewer than that, are modern operas. So I'm curious to ask you what you think about the survival of opera as a modern art form, and your own views about singing modern opera.
Well, I have only sung one modern opera in my life, and that was my professional debut. It was a world premiere. Belgian composer, German opera, based on Frank Wedekind's, same man who wrote Lulu, the same playwright who wrote Lulu, his play Spring's Awakening. And that was done as an opera, and that's really been the only thing that I had done to this point that is modern. Again, I think it comes down to the quality of an individual voice and how comfortable that instrument is in a given modern setting. There's a lot more variety of roles available to modern singers, I would say. There's so many composers out there, but a lot of them don't necessarily stick, and I'm not really sure why that is.
A lot
But
of them don't write very well for the human voice.
There does come to be a point where I think some of the composers may try to write too much of the theatrics into the score that they forget about what is actually necessary in order to produce those theatrics. But Max Rudolph, who was a great conductor and musical scholar, and I'm fortunate to sort of have a direct lineage to him in my own studies, in his writings, because he was director in Cincinnati for many years, and he was very much a champion of presenting new modern works at the time through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But he had said that the biggest problem with getting modern music to stick is the fact that people just don't play it enough. Because everything at some point is new, and the only way that it becomes familiar is if it's done more and more. So
I agree with that, because once you're thrown in and you don't know what's going on, you're like, what is this? Why am I learning these hard passages? And why does this conductor want me to sing? You know, all these things that seem so foreign. But once you've spent time with it, and you get to learn it, and you actually know what you're singing and how to do this and what your motive is, then it becomes a part of you. You're like, oh, I think I can do this. This is funny. Let's see if we can get the audience to understand it. So, my experience, that happened with Postcards from Morocco by Dominic Argento, and nobody gets that opera because it's a puppet show. So, other than that, you still, whatever you can relate to, what's familiar to you, you'll hold on to.
I find a lot of composers have their own language, like Benjamin Britten, and we're not particularly modern, but to our ear, it's still modern sounding compared to Rossini, of course. But once you learn his musical language, it becomes really fabulous and delicious and fun to sing. And I think if it's fun for the singers, it's fun for the audience. Yeah, that's the main thing. So if we can bring it to life in a way that you appreciate it and want to hear it, then I think modern opera will survive.
Well, from a director's point of view, a lot of the modern operas I've seen have pretty weak librettos because the dramaturgy isn't very good. And you're talking, well, the storytelling isn't very good. Ultimately, the audience wants a good plot, a good emotional story. And if you're talking about concepts, that's all very well, but you can do that in a tone poem as well. But even in the 19th century, for every opera that survived, how many were written that did not? No, and you can't just say, well, we write an opera and it's all of them are experiments. If they're any good, in a way, if they're trying to break new ground, yes, they are experiments, and sometimes it's just not going to work so well.
I don't want you to end your comments if you have more to say, because this is a huge subject for me. As the director of the company and having fiscal responsibility of the company sitting on my desk, the choice of repertoire that we produce is huge. So if we're doing 4 operas each season and 25% of it is dedicated to a work that people have little interest in, then you can see the consequences. Now, let's look at a kind of statistical backdrop for this question and this discussion. Rossini was unique in music. He wrote 2 operas a year for 16 years, 30 years. Oh, stop composing. And became very wealthy and very fat because he focused on cooking. But the point is, he is an anomaly in the history of music to have been as wealthy and successful as he was. Donizetti, a composer from the same era, wrote 96 operas. And you haven't heard most of them. But everybody loves Lucia and Elixir of Love, and some of these are definitely in the list of the greatest masterpieces written for the stage. At the turn of the century, the 20th century, there were over 100,000 opera scores in the Bibliothèque Nationale. Matthew triggered this thought because he says, how many were written that did not survive? Well, when you consider that Donizetti's writing 96 works that were all put on the stage, and Rossini was grinding them out, and Verdi wrote 27, either 27 or 29, depending on how you number the ones that he wrote for Paris and then changed the title and rewrote it for Italy, things like that. So let's use 29 as the maximum exposure. You can see that quantity and quality are often in conflict. Now, when we get to what causes a work to survive, to be in that golden circle of composers that has more than 2 operas that are regularly performed throughout the world, you're talking about Mozart, Puccini, Verdi, Wagner, Richard Strauss, who's got 4 actually that we put in the top 25, 30 operas. And then you've got all of these composers like Leoncavallo and Ponchielli and people like that that have a masterpiece that holds the stage throughout the world. And that number of works that we produce over and over and over and over and over is about 65 to 70 works out of that 100,000 sitting there on the shelf. It's more than 100,000. So, my personal philosophy, and this is just speaking as an artist and also as an administrator, is that any significant opera company, define significant in your own mind, any significant opera company should participate in the art of its own time. So we should, yes, be doing Peter Grimes, which we had planned and then I ended up abandoning as too expensive for potential return. We should be doing contemporary works. Can we withstand the economic pressures of those decisions? Well, when we entered an era of the last 3 or 4 years where there were great, great challenges for all of the arts in the country, that became a very low concern for me. I think just keeping our foundations intact, and that's one of the roles that Todd plays, is working on those projects, finding the financial resources, working with these things. So your decisions end up being made, sadly, by default. But I was also struck as I listened to Deborah speak about musical language, and Lenora mentioned the challenges of learning a new score and then coming to appreciate it. Because Britain's Peter Grimes and Albert Herring are very conventional language, but if you get into the no drums, that Curlew River, Burning Fiery Furnace, and the Prodigal Son, that's very abstract music. So he has such a rich range of offerings. But I also heard someone ask me today, they made an interesting comment. They said, did you get a chance to see The Tempest yesterday in the HD broadcast? Well, I didn't, because we were having our Sitzprobe from 2 to 5, symphony and singers. And they said, a lot of people didn't like it because the music was dissonant. Well, Thomas Addison's music is considered by contemporary standards to be very diatonic. But here's someone that I guess goes and says, okay, this is not the language, the vocal-oriented language of 19th century opera. There's a reason that Puccini is the most popular composer in the world right now in the field of opera. So, you said, and as I jokingly say, well, it wouldn't matter what new opera I did, if it didn't sound like Puccini, people wouldn't much care. But those are the challenges, and that is, you need to bring the intellectual wherewithal to the challenge, to come in and say, okay, if it's not going to be just the language that I am most comfortable with, that I can put on that comfortable pair of shoes, I want to be challenged, and that's where I do think that the theatrical aspect of it, and that would be back into Matthew's domain, of is the libretto strong and engaging as a piece of theater, and is the structure of the piece operatically enhancing the theatricality of the language, and do we walk out of there not necessarily having to be able to whistle those melodies, but feeling that the unique language that is opera, that is truly music, drama, has reached us in the same way that a Puccini opera or a Mozart opera or a Verdi opera does. Now, we know the language of those composers, and we know how they turn the emotional switches on and off. The question is, can a contemporary composer do that? Of course they can. Will they? Of course they will. How long will it be before we see other significant music theater pieces? If you take it out of 120,000 pieces, 60, then you can see what the percentages are that you're dealing with. To say those that reach every culture, every era, can be restated and have that emotional language component in them. That's the statistical backdrop about that question. Yes?
You know, if you look at Erich Korngold, for example, who was a phenomenal composer, built only for my knowledge one opera that's never produced, but he's just sort of gave it up because of the financial lure of Hollywood. He became very, very wealthy because he could write music scores and get paid for it. And, you know, I'm beginning to think that a lot of modern composers of opera just are doing other things. That there's a lucrativeness of musical comedy, of other things where people can make billions of dollars on a production.
let me, I don't want to cut you off, but we do have a little press of time here. I would just share with you that as the general director of the opera company, I receive constant solicitations from composers, sending me scores, sending me CDs, sending me DVDs, sending me libretti, saying, would you consider producing my opera? My response over the years has evolved to the point of saying, if it's never been workshopped, if you've never addressed it in that way, what you need to do is become the best friend of your local university opera workshop person, because they have the resources that you need without the costs that we bear. Since everything that we do is union-based, for us to invest in the creation of a new piece is hundreds of thousands of dollars. If we spend $500,000 on a production, I can promise you that a new piece will be $1,200,000. Why? Not just the new sets and costumes and music parts and all of these things, but the whole process. So what I say is get some legs under this thing. Take it to somebody, your civic theater or your local university, and they can devote 18 weeks in a semester to finding those issues and addressing them. And we all want, since Matthew runs the Florida State University program, then that's probably less welcoming to him. But I certainly can't just say, well, look, this looks great. Let's spend $500,000 to see if it has merit. Right. You see, and so at that point you take a deep breath and you say, okay, there needs to be a process, and there are foundations out there that address this, and there are processes like that. But there's no easy answer, because often at the end of the process you realize this piece is not going to survive. I can give you a simple example, Houston Grand Opera. David Gockley is someone that I greatly admire, ran that program for 28 years and did 29 premieres, one annually and 1 year too. And I dare say out of that there are only 2 or 3 that still hold the stage. Is that wasted money? Of course not. We're richer for it. The art form is richer for the experimentation, for the process, for keeping composers engaged. Korn Gold is an interesting example. Die Totenstadt, which is a work I very much would love to do, but you all have to have been smoking pot or something like that to enjoy it, since it's all about hallucinations.
I'm in Colorado, we'll be doing it next year.
And Yolanta is another opera that he did write. But here is a genius young man in his very early 20s, 22 years old, writing this sprawling piece that is fabulously rich musically. And yet, if we undertook it, would we have any audience response? And can I rely on you to be there if I can convince the board? And I mean, that's literally a serious question. But if you're going to say to me, as one woman did, well, my husband and I never go to anything we don't know, and I say, well, I said, how did you go to your first opera? Well, it was a short conversation, obviously. but that is the dilemma, Scott, of new works. I wish that we were enjoying the point of view of the 18th and 19th century, where the public truly looked forward to the latest work of Verdi or the latest work of Rossini. Mm-hmm. They were events, they were occasions, they came, they threw vegetables, they did whatever they did to express their support or dislike of. We don't do that anymore. We simply don't. It's been totally affected by different entertainment values, by the availability of film as an art form. You can create a movie version of a subject in a couple of months. You can't do that with a novel. So I've said too much.
With that, we've gone over a bit because the singers have got to get to rehearsal. All of you got to get to rehearsal. I want to thank you all for being here today, and thank you all. On the other side here, the ladies have prepared a wonderful reception for you. So thank you all.